Hello and welcome back. For this particular session, we're going to turn this into a proper review by going over some of the more specific essays, maybe ones that we haven't worked on extensively in the tasks that I've had you do, or they could just be slightly longer ones that I think I need to summarize for you a little bit, just so you can wrap your brain around. Remember, the examples that you use are going to be your own, right? So when I ask you a question about this and I ask you for specific support, you would go into the readings themselves and you would find quotes or you would find ways to summarize individual points, okay? So I'm not going to get overly detailed to the point where I'm going to answer any questions for you, but I will give you something that maybe you can wrap your brain around, especially with some of these longer, more complicated readings that you may have cast your eyes over, but then need some sort of lens to view them through. Okay, so I'm going to start with the one I have up on BAT here, Personal and Collective Unconscious. That would be the Jung article. Jung is big on dreams. He's big on collective unconscious that we can tap into, meaning that I guess a good way to think about it is similar to Joseph Campbell's idea of the monomyth, meaning that there's sort of this deeper understanding of human nature, sort of this big, deep pool that we dip into. We have common ideas about how symbols work, about how we view aspects of humanity and our consciousness. Okay, so consciousness is derived from sort of this deep, mysterious human pool that everybody, not everybody, but there's a lot of common elements there that we, like for example, he uses dreams a lot. He uses dreams as sort of metaphors for, well, not even maybe even a little bit more than metaphors, as if dreams are sort of symbolic of this unconscious. And so how we identify the elements of those dreams, or those, maybe even we could expand that to hopes, tells us a little bit about sort of how the psychology of the unconscious works. And of course, if it's unconscious, it's not something we're doing consciously, right? So when we make conscious decisions about things, we think that we're making them independent of anything else, or at least we used to at the time of he was reading. He was very influenced by Freud, and Freud was influenced by him. There's kind of back and forth. A lot of this stuff scientifically doesn't necessarily stand up, but it does offer, much like Freud, a model for viewing the way that we engage with symbols and symbolism. Okay, so as a way of understanding this, maybe that's the best way of thinking about it, is that he uses these examples as a collective imagery that we use. And if you've read my little introduction, it basically says, I use it as an example of how narratives, subconsciously affect us, elements of that unconscious. So just think of it as sort of a model. And if you can draw some more specifics from that, I think that would be helpful in explaining that idea. So I think there's a very natural connection with either Campbell or narrative, the way I've described it earlier. I'm going to move on a little bit to Freire, but I did post a video explaining a few things from that, so I'm not going to go over it ad nauseum. But Freire was, again, the idea of this system of oppression that exists within educational institutions that he's trying to break out of. The thing that I did not include, because these are just a series of excerpts, is his solution for this oppression, as he defines it in this teacher-student relationship. He goes into that pretty extensively as well. Narrative, again, pops up in this one a lot. Actually, probably Freire is the most direct person that addresses it. And so this idea of the narrative of the teacher-student relationship, one puts them in an adversarial role. And so the solution to that, which is not included in this particular selection extensively, but he suggested, is that it should be more of what I've referred to in some of the other sections in 108 as a dialogue, right? And that they say, I say. So the closer it gets to sort of a dialogue and a conversation that's going back and forth, where you give me some information, I take that information, and then I sort of model my behavior and responses, and the education that you're trying to get individually That is sort of the solution. So the more it becomes a conversation rather than just me telling you what to do and you doing it, probably the better. So that's a way of thinking about that. Moving on to blue-collar brilliance. Blue-collar brilliance is really pretty accessible, and most of you have worked with it. So I'll just say, just to remind you that that is a story. He starts with his mother and how she used to work in a restaurant, and so the kind of work that she did was not recognized as important or even as intellectual, but yet her and many people like her that aren't recognized for their brilliance, meaning the things that the way they actually use their brain, goes under the radar, right? And it's because we have these assumptions about what important work is versus unimportant work, right? And so that's a primer on this idea of class and not so much race, but the idea of class and sort of how it affects our perception. Just because I can, take apart a Shakespeare and do research doesn't mean that that's the only way to do research and the only way to take something apart intellectually. Okay, so it's a story of not only his own background, his parents' background, but sort of what he sees as this ability to sort of have this blind spot for ways that people are intelligent simply because we have this overriding idea of class. Okay. Case for reparations is a little more difficult to get into because that's pretty long and it's got a lot of sections. So depending on how you use this, you may have already focused mostly on one section of this. If you've read the whole thing, then that's awesome. I give you different sections to look at, but I'll go over some of the slides that I created for another one of my classes that I wasn't able to go over as extensively in this one. And I'll see if I can just do this in a few minutes. Some background. He introduces this idea of history. The model for this is Roman numerals. It echoes the articles maybe of the Constitution, or if you look at the older documents, they are put together in much the same way, sort of as this Articles of Declaration, And so I think he's harking back, and he does actually specifically hark back to some of these other things in the little introduction that I have. And then each one of these sections breaks down into different ideas. It's basically his case, right? He's making an argument. So one of the things to think about is, section 1, so that's just one of our losses. Some of the things we can ask ourselves is, what do the headers mean? He spends time, in this case, establishing the story of Clyde Ross. He uses terms like kleptocracy. So it's basically building a case, and in this one, he's offering a specific example of somebody that's trapped within this system. Okay? And then later on, as he goes on, he offers more broad examples of the history in the South. As you can see, I'll let you freeze and pause and go back as much as you want. I may. So a difference of kind, not degree, is section 2. He talks about other specific examples, and then he introduces, not just in this one, but in many cases, he introduces statistics. Basically different anomalies that can be explained through sort of this history of racism. And then over here, he's got a difference of kind, not degree. He introduces terms like cultural pathology and how that works to undermine some of the solutions that he thinks are going to bring about change. Okay. And then section 5, a quiet plunder. He identifies more of the history of how the economy was built in America as he sees it. He couches some of the terms in terms of more specific, perhaps sympathetic viewpoints. And then it goes on, and it does that. As you can see, the structure is pretty effective in the sense, and I'll just kind of keep scrolling if you want. It's pretty effective in the sense that it introduces sort of a sympathetic element, maybe by a specific example of somebody that's trapped within these institutions, and then he follows it up with pretty extensive research and statistics. And so what he's basically saying in the later parts is sort of how to understand this, how to view it, and how to maybe move forward from this point. And of course, his ultimate response is the idea of reparations, which is a term that you probably want to understand the way Coates uses it, meaning that it's not a unique or unusual thing in history. He's not introducing something new, like, for example, he uses the idea of after World War II, the Jews were compensated for their injuries by the German government, and they were given stipends. So there is then, among other examples that he produces. So it's not historically as radical, and that won't necessarily make you see all that, as radical as it sounds. So that's a primer on that. Moving on to Machiavelli. That's another one that you want to look at because I do think that it tells you a little bit of something about how an entirely neutral spectator would view effective government. And that's sort of a broader idea of history and maybe narrative and social scripts. What do I mean by that? At first, it doesn't appear that way, but if you think about the prince himself, right? Who is the prince in Machiavelli's The Prince? He's basically somebody that wants to be effective, right? Not necessarily a good guy or a bad guy, but he wants to stay there. And so Machiavelli basically offers advice on how one should act, not just in government, but in any walk of life. You could borrow it if you're sort of an amoral person. And he offers hints and suggestions about this is what is effective, okay? So in other words, it's better to be feared than loved. What does he mean by that? Does he mean that being feared is good and being loved is bad? No. He just means that if you're feared, you're probably going to be more effective than if you're purely loved. Okay, if you're purely feared versus purely loved. You have to make that decision as a leader, and it's better to be feared because that's going to be a more effective way to govern. Okay, not good, not a better way to govern, like as in what's better for the people, but how do you stay in power and how do you get things moving, right? Whatever your goals are. Another one is, you start off getting into the weeds a little bit, some other bits of advice, like you have to start off really mean so that you can let up because people are more willing to sort of accept that that there's strict guidelines, that they're going to have strict guidelines at first, and then later on, it's easier to get them to just accept that they're going to, giving them little morsels along the way will be more effective than starting off really nice and then saying, wait a minute, we've gone too far. Let's cut things back. Okay? So little things like that, right? It's better to be, strict at first and then ease up rather than be really easy at first and then get stricter and find that middle ground, because in either cases, you're trying to find that middle ground, right? So lots of little things like that, and examples that you can probably borrow for maybe broader ideas of narratives and social scripts. That might be a little bit complicated for some of you, but for some of you that are really interested in stuff like that, there's lots of little nuggets. Letter from Birmingham Jail is the one that we just went over, but just remember that is an argument that he's making to other Southern preachers while he's in jail, because they're complaining that he's just causing trouble, right? And so he argues through historical examples and through various ethical reasons why you have to cause trouble sometimes in order to get things done, even if you're the peaceable sort and you're just the one that wants to get along to go along. Sometimes that's not a good thing because it plays into the hands of the oppressor, because the oppressor is very interested in slowing things down, and occasionally you have to be in the habit of trying to speed things up, because then your misery is not the same as your oppressor's misery. Okay? So I hope that helps, and I hope that is a primer on what you should be looking at initially, and then as we open up the midterm, I'll give you further instructions, and you probably are already able to look at some of those initial instructions in terms of how to approach the midterm. But then when the prompt opens up, you'll have a few days to work with that. Okay? All right, thank you. I hope this helped.